The New Testament is not a single book, as many assume. In fact, it is a collection of 27 distinct writings, composed across different periods for different communities. And these texts didn't emerge during Jesus' lifetime, but rather decades after his death. In this video, we will examine the layered structure of the New Testament through a historical lens. Our goal is not to debate the theological messages of these texts, but to explore when they were written, by whom, and under what historical and social circumstances, from the crises faced by the earliest Christian communities to the letters of Paul, and then to the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. We'll trace the development of these writings step by step. Along the way, the Acts of the Apostles, the Book of Revelation, and the remaining epistles will also join our journey. The method we'll be using is historical critical analysis. This is the same framework modern historians and textual scholars use when approaching ancient texts. Source criticism, redaction analysis, stylistic comparisons, and historical contextualization all offer valuable clues into how these texts evolved. According to traditional accounts, these books were authored by the apostles, but the historical method shows us that the story isn't quite so simple. Most of the author names are later attributions. What truly matters is understanding which needs these texts addressed, and when. This video was not made to cast doubt on sacred scripture, but to approach it with greater depth and honesty. Reading a text in its historical context doesn't diminish it, it reveals its true power. So if you're ready, let's begin with a question. What happened after the death of Jesus? Jesus' life likely came to an end around 30 CE in Judea under Roman rule by crucifixion. Ancient sources, both Christian and non-Christian, are largely in agreement on this point. Jesus was executed by the Roman authorities. But what happened next? From a historical perspective, what stands out most is the transformation among his followers. A small group that had just lost its leader began, within a short time, to believe that he had been raised from the dead by God and that he was the Messiah. This moment marks the birth of Christian faith. The earliest written reference to this belief appears in one of Paul's letters to the Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes that Jesus died, was buried, was raised on the third day, and appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. This is more than a theological statement. It reflects a creedal formula already in circulation among early believers, and it may even predate the letter itself. Some scholars suggest that these words go back to as early as 35 to 40 CE, just a few years after the crucifixion. In other words, belief in the resurrection spread very quickly. These early accounts were first transmitted orally. The story of the empty tomb, however, is more debated. Although it appears in all 4 canonical Gospels, Paul never explicitly mentions the tomb being empty. Some scholars argue that the first appearance of this detail is in the Gospel of Mark, written around 70 CE. That raises the possibility that the empty tomb was a later theological development. But there is no scholarly consensus on this. So, how authentic are the earliest resurrection claims? Paul is the closest writer, chronologically, to the events. He believed just a few years after Jesus' death. But even Paul never met Jesus in person. His experience of the risen Christ was visionary in nature, and that opens the door to an ongoing scholarly debate. Was the resurrection originally understood as physical or spiritual? What we can say with some confidence is this. Very soon after Jesus' death, a number of his followers came to believe that he was still alive, elevated by God. This belief did not begin with empty tombs or dramatic appearances, but as a shared response to grief, crisis, and hope. And it laid the foundation for a faith tradition that would soon find written form and eventually sacred canon. After Jesus' death, his small group of followers did not disperse. On the contrary, they gathered in Jerusalem and soon formed an organized community. Leading figures in this early Christian group included Peter, James the brother of Jesus, and the remaining apostles. They claimed to have witnessed Jesus' life and proclaimed that he had been raised from the dead by God. At this stage, the early community had no written texts. Their faith and the teachings of Jesus were transmitted orally. Modern scholars refer to this period as the era of oral tradition. Sayings, short stories, miracle accounts, and parables circulated by word of mouth among early believers. Especially Jesus' teachings, memorable aphorisms and parables occupied a central place in the collective memory of the time. Such oral transmission was common in the ancient world. Religious and historical knowledge was passed down more through memory than through manuscripts. But oral tradition is not fixed. It can evolve depending on who tells it, what the audience expects, and how the social context changes. That's why historians question how stable or original these early oral accounts truly were. This is where scholarly theories about the writing of the Gospels begin to emerge. In particular, the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, share striking similarities, but also notable differences. It appears that both Matthew and Luke used Mark as a primary source. Yet there are sayings attributed to Jesus that appear in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. To explain this shared material, scholars have proposed a hypothetical document, the Q source. Named after the German word Quelle, meaning source, Q is thought to be a lost collection of Jesus' sayings. We have no physical copy of such a document, but the parallels between Matthew and Luke suggest they may have drawn on an earlier, now lost source that preserved oral teachings of Jesus. While Q cannot be proven, it provides a useful model. It implies that the oral tradition may have been preserved and transmitted in a more structured way than previously thought. At this point, no written gospel existed, but the stories were taking shape. Different interpretations of who Jesus was, why he died, and why he was believed to have been raised were developing within these oral traditions. And those traditions would soon form the backbone of the written texts that followed in the decades ahead. After Jesus' death, the early Christian communities began to grow, and not just in Jerusalem. New congregations were emerging in Greco-Roman cities like Antioch, Corinth, and Ephesus. One of the most prominent historical figures behind this early expansion is the Apostle Paul. Paul was a Jew from Tarsus. Although he never met Jesus during his lifetime, Paul claimed to have encountered the risen Christ in a vision and dedicated his life to spreading his message. Today, we have letters written by Paul, considered to be the earliest Christian documents still in existence. These are not gospels or biographies. They are real-time correspondence between Paul and the communities he founded or interacted with. The majority of historians agree that 7 of these letters are authentic, meaning they were truly written by Paul himself. These are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and Romans. The earliest of them, 1 Thessalonians, was likely written around 49 CE, making it the oldest surviving text in the New Testament. These letters were not meant to build systematic theology. They were written to address very practical concerns. Some respond to moral issues within the churches. Others deal with questions like, why has Jesus not returned yet? Or how should we relate to pagan customs? Through them, Paul tried to shape the beliefs, behavior, and identity of his communities. As such, they offer a vivid window into the lived realities and inner conflicts of early Christianity. But not all letters attributed to Paul were actually written by him. Out of the 13 Pauline epistles in the New Testament, only 7 are widely regarded as genuine. The most contested among the remaining ones are 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, known collectively as the pastoral epistles. Differences in language, theological emphasis, and references to church hierarchy suggest that these letters come from a later period. For instance, while the authentic Pauline letters make no mention of formal church offices, the pastoral epistles refer to bishops, deacons, and detailed regulations. These reflect developments more consistent with the early 2nd century. Linguistically, the pastorals contain dozens of Greek words that never appear in Paul's other letters. These differences are clearly identifiable through philological and thematic analysis. So, who wrote these non-authentic letters, and why? The term forged here does not imply malicious deception, but rather reflects a different, ancient understanding of authorship. In antiquity, it was not unusual for writers aligned with a particular tradition to write under the name of a revered teacher. Some early Christians seeking to invoke Paul's authority may have written in his name to offer guidance to their own communities. In that sense, the goal was not fraud, but legitimacy. Today, scholars use multiple tools to determine which letters truly come from Paul: linguistic style, historical context, theological structure, internal consistency, and the nature of the communities described. Through these methods, we can better distinguish the voice of the historical Paul from that of his later interpreters. In the end, Paul's letters are central not only to the history of early Christianity, but to the formation of the New Testament itself. As the earliest written texts, they played a defining role in shaping the narratives that would follow. After Paul's letters, the second major layer of the New Testament consists of the Gospels. These four texts, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, present narratives about Jesus' life, teachings, death, and resurrection, but they do not tell the story in the same way. In particular, the first three, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, share a strong structural resemblance. They are known as the synoptic Gospels because they often describe the same events in the same order and with similar wording. This similarity raises an important question for historians. Did these texts copy from one another? If so, which came first? Most scholars agree that Mark was the earliest of the three, likely written between 65 and 75 CE, around the time of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Mark is fast-paced and concise. It emphasizes action over detail, says nothing about Jesus' birth, begins with his baptism, and ends with the discovery of an empty tomb. So how did Matthew and Luke approach the story? Both appear to have used Mark as a base, but they also share material that is not found in Mark, mostly sayings of Jesus. Examples include the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer, which appear in both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. This shared content led scholars to propose a hypothetical document known as the Q source, a lost collection of Jesus' sayings, possibly oral or written. Though Q has never been discovered, the traces of shared content make it a compelling theory. Matthew and Luke not only use Mark but also expand and reshape it. Matthew presents Jesus as a new Moses, a teacher of divine law, and tailors the narrative to Jewish traditions. Luke, on the other hand, offers a more universal vision, portraying Jesus as the savior not only of the Jews, but of all humanity. These differences reflect not only narrative evolution, but also the distinct needs and identities of the communities behind each gospel. This is where redaction criticism becomes relevant, a method for analyzing how and why authors modify their sources. For instance, in Mark, Jesus' final words on the cross are, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In Luke, the same scene ends with, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." This is not just a stylistic change, it reflects a deeper theological shift from Mark's suffering and human Jesus to Luke's calm and divine figure. Different presentations of the same event suggest changing beliefs, not just changing words. We see a similar evolution in the empty tomb narrative. In Mark, it is brief and sparse. Women discover the tomb is empty, are told Jesus has risen, and flee in fear without saying a word. In Matthew, the women speak with an angel and see the risen Jesus. In Luke, the story becomes more developed, with multiple appearances. In John, Jesus shares an emotional conversation with Mary Magdalene and appears in ways that suggest physical contact. These growing layers reflect a deepening not only in storytelling but in theology. So why were these texts written at all? Why move from oral tradition to written gospels? There are several reasons. First, the eyewitness generation was aging and dying. Second-generation Christians needed written accounts. Second, the Christian movement was expanding across vast regions, from Rome to Ephesus, and needed shared narratives. Third, internal conflicts and divergent teachings emerged. The Gospels were not just meant to inform, but to assert authority and shape belief. This brings us to the question of authorship. Mark, Matthew, and Luke were originally anonymous. They were not titled the Gospel of Mark or of Matthew at the time of writing. These titles were added in the 2nd century as part of tradition. We have no direct evidence that the Apostle Matthew actually wrote the Gospel bearing his name. The same goes for Mark and Luke. These names likely serve to grant the text's credibility. In antiquity, a text's authority often depended on its attributed author. A gospel written by an apostle would have been more readily accepted. That's why many scholars view these attributions as traditional rather than historical. In the end, the Gospels are not raw historical accounts. They are shaped, selected, edited, and theologically interpreted narratives. Each one makes a truth claim about Jesus, but each also reflects the cultural, spiritual, and communal needs of its own time. For historians, reading the Gospels means asking not just what is said, but why it is said that way. The last of the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, stands apart in striking ways. While Mark, Matthew, and Luke share a common narrative framework, John presents a radically different portrait of Jesus. This difference is evident not only in the structure and language, but also in the theological emphasis. The synoptic Gospels portrayed Jesus as a historical figure, a preacher, a healer, a teacher. But in John, Jesus is introduced from the very beginning as the eternal Logos, the divine word. In the beginning was the Word. The opening of John does not merely describe a prophet or a messianic figure, but God made flesh. This is one of the most advanced stages of Christology in early Christianity. Even Jesus' miracles are redefined. They're no longer simply acts of compassion or signs of divine authority. They become signs that reveal his metaphysical identity. And his sayings shift dramatically as well. Gone are the short aphorisms and parables of the synoptics. In their place, we find extended theological discourses, philosophical dialogues filled with layered meaning. The language of John's Gospel is also notable. Unlike the relatively plain Greek of the synoptics, John employs a more polished, theologically rich form of Greek. This has led most scholars to date the Gospel between 90 and 110 CE, suggesting a later composition. Such differences point to a different community behind the text. John was likely written by a Jewish Christian group based in Syria or Western Anatolia, a community that had been excluded from mainstream Jewish life and had developed a distinct identity. They remained rooted in Jewish tradition, but also embraced a radical belief in Jesus' divinity. This dual identity gives the Gospel both a mystical depth and, at times, a polemical tone. Tensions are especially evident in passages referring to the Jews, reflecting the community's sense of marginalization and conflict. As for authorship, the Gospel doesn't name its writer. It refers instead to the beloved disciple, a figure traditionally identified as the Apostle John. But modern scholarship questions this attribution. The text appears to be multi-layered, containing eyewitness memories, theological reinterpretations, and perhaps editorial revisions. In this view, John's Gospel is less the work of a single author and more the product of a community's collective memory and theological vision. Connected to this Gospel is a group of texts known as the Johannine writings, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd epistles of John. Some scholars even argue that the Book of Revelation may have emerged from the fringes of this tradition, though its style and content are quite different. In summary, the Gospel of John is both the latest and the most theologically developed of the 4 Gospels. Its unique features not only reshape our understanding of Jesus, but also reveal a great deal about the community that crafted and preserved his story. Acts of the Apostles is the only book in the New Testament written in the form of a historical narrative. It is, in fact, a direct continuation of the Gospel of Luke. Both texts are traditionally attributed to the same author and together present the most comprehensive account of early Christianity, from Jesus' ascension to Paul's imprisonment in Rome. But the question remains, is this book actually history, or is it constructing a theological narrative? Acts presents itself as a work of history, but the choice of events, the speeches given to key figures, and the structure of the narrative suggest that the author is not merely recounting what happened, but what he believed should have happened. The book seeks to explain how Christianity separated from Judaism and took root within the Roman world. Key figures like Peter and Paul take center stage in this process. However, one striking issue is the discrepancy between the Paul we meet in his letters and the Paul portrayed in Acts. In his own letters, Paul emphasizes his independent authority. He insists he received his message directly from God and sees himself as equal to the apostles in Jerusalem. But in Acts, Paul appears more conciliatory, submissive to church leaders, and loyal to Roman authority. This raises an important question. Was Acts written to tell Rome, "We are not a threat"? Some scholars argue that this was exactly the author's goal. Throughout the book, Roman officials are often depicted as treating Paul fairly, while conflicts are typically instigated by Jewish authorities. In this way, Christianity is presented not as a revolutionary movement, but as a universal faith at peace with the imperial order. As for authorship, traditionally Acts has been attributed to Luke, believed to be a physician and companion of Paul, but this is a tradition that only emerged in the 2nd century. Nowhere in the text does the author identify himself as Luke, and the style and perspective of the writing suggest a later composition, removed from the events it describes. For this reason, many scholars accept that Luke and Acts were written by the same individual, but whether that person was truly named Luke remains uncertain. In the end, Acts doesn't just tell us what early Christians experienced, it tells us how they wanted to be remembered. It offers invaluable insight into how Christian identity was shaped and legitimized within the Roman world. In the final sections of the New Testament, we find texts that do not recount the life of Jesus, but instead reflect the beliefs, concerns, and challenges of the early Christian communities. Among these are the letters attributed to Peter and Jude, as well as the strikingly unique book of Revelation. But how authentic, historical, and theological are these writings? The letters of 1 and 2 Peter are traditionally attributed to the Apostle Peter. However, modern scholarship casts significant doubt, especially on 2 Peter. Its language, vocabulary, and theological content suggest a much later composition than Paul's letters, or even the Book of Acts. Some researchers date it between 120 to 140 CE, well after Peter's death. As for 1 Peter, it may be slightly earlier, but the question remains, was it written by Peter himself or by someone writing in his name? A similar debate surrounds the letter of Jude. This brief epistle is attributed to Jude, the brother of Jesus. But there is no solid external evidence to confirm this authorship. Notably, the letter references apocryphal works like the Book of Enoch, suggesting it emerged in a time when the boundaries between Jewish and Christian thought were still fluid. And then comes the most visually dramatic and theologically charged text in the New Testament, the Book of Revelation, also called the Apocalypse of John. Its pages are filled with symbols, beasts, seals, heavenly battles, and golden cities. But behind this vivid symbolism lies not just theology, but a very concrete historical context. Revelation was likely written between 90 and 100 CE, during a period of Roman imperial pressure. Many scholars believe the persecutions under Emperor Domitian shaped the tone and themes of the book. The beasts are often interpreted as symbols of the Roman Empire, and the Whore of Babylon is widely seen as a metaphor for Rome itself. Thus, Revelation is not simply an apocalyptic forecast. It also served as a language of resistance for a persecuted community. Themes of hope, endurance, and divine justice provided a psychological anchor during times of fear and oppression. So who was the author? The text identifies him only as John, but scholars remain divided on whether he was the Apostle John, the author of the Gospel of John, or another figure entirely. The differences in language, style, and theology between Revelation and the Gospel of John are significant, suggesting they were likely written by different individuals for different communities. In the end, these late letters and Revelation mark a phase where Christianity was evolving from a belief system into a communal identity shaped by survival, separation, and longing. These texts are not only theological reflections, they also offer key insight into the psychology and emotional landscape of early Christian communities. To truly understand the New Testament, we must ask not just what was written, but why it was written, and for whom. Because these are not abstract theological treatises, each text speaks to the concrete needs, fears, or hopes of a particular community. Mark's Gospel is in a hurry because the community is in trauma. The Jerusalem temple has been destroyed, and a collective identity is falling apart. In this context, Mark presents the crucifixion of Jesus not as a disaster, but as the climax of God's plan. Matthew's community, meanwhile, has been separated from its Jewish roots, yet still seeks to defend a Jewish Christian identity. So Jesus is portrayed as a new Moses, a teacher of divine law. Luke emphasizes universality. His audience is trying to integrate into the Greco-Roman world. And in John, we encounter a community that feels rejected and persecuted, clinging tightly to Jesus' divine identity. The exaltation of Jesus as the eternal Logos is no accident. Because of this, some academic approaches describe the Gospels not merely as historical records, but as historical novels with theological intent. Here, the term novel is not meant to diminish their value, rather it acknowledges their narrative, selective, and interpretive nature. These texts are less about what happened and more about what it meant, and that means they were written with clear purpose, structure, and theological direction. So who wrote these texts? The truth is, most New Testament writings are anonymous. The names Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John do not appear in the original manuscripts. These titles were added in the 2nd century, decades after the texts were composed. They were likely assigned to bolster authority. A gospel written by an apostle was taken far more seriously than one by an ordinary believer. Yet modern scholarship has shown that these names cannot be confirmed biographically. Was Matthew truly the tax collector and disciple? Was Luke really Paul's travel companion? We simply don't know. What we can say is that the choice of these names likely reflects the tradition the texts came from and the voices they were meant to represent. In the end, the New Testament texts are not only sacred scripture, they are also historical documents and social responses. Each one is a voice of its time, expressing identity anxiety, hope for salvation, perceived threats, or a defense of belief. Every line written was an answer to a pressing question, and those questions were not only about faith but about survival. At this point, a natural question arises. How do historians extract all this information? After all, the texts about Jesus were written almost 2,000 years ago, and most of them are anonymous. So how can we know when a text was written, by whom, and which parts are original versus later additions? The answer lies in the methods used by historians and textual critics. One of the most important of these methods is called layer analysis. Layer analysis attempts to identify different strata within a single text, sections that may have been written or added at different times. For example, some passages in Paul's letters stand out as stylistically inconsistent. The greetings are unusually long, the vocabulary shifts, or the narrative flow is disrupted. Scholars follow these clues to determine whether certain verses were later insertions. A famous case is 1 Corinthians 14:34-35, which says, "Women should remain silent in churches." This passage seems tacked on and clashes with Paul's tone elsewhere, so it's often flagged as a possible interpolation. The second method is philological analysis, a deep study of language, style, and word choice. Every writer, consciously or not, uses a particular vocabulary and sentence structure. They also reflect the linguistic patterns of their time. For instance, the Greek used in Paul's 7 authentic letters is quite different from the Greek in 1 Timothy. In fact, some phrases in 1 Timothy didn't even exist in Paul's era, so linguistic analysis helps us assess both authorship and approximate date. A third crucial tool is historical context analysis. What kind of world does the text describe? Take the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE, a massive turning point for all Jews of the time. If a text doesn't mention it and speaks as if the temple still stands, it was likely written before that event. But if it contains allusions to the destruction, like Mark 13, then it likely dates to around or after 70 CE. Once all this analysis is done, scholars often reach different conclusions. Which brings us to a fourth point, academic disagreement. Take Bart Ehrman, for instance. He emphasizes contradictions and later edits in the texts. To him, the New Testament evolved over time and was reshaped to meet theological needs. Ehrman's approach is secular and critical. John Dominic Crossan, on the other hand, focuses less on literal history and more on the poetic nature of oral traditions. He sees the Gospels as dramatic faith proclamations. To him, Jesus was a leader of a rural wisdom movement, not a divine saviour. Dale Allison takes a more cautious middle ground. He argues that both historical and theological elements can coexist, and that some miracle stories may reflect real human experiences at their core. N.T. Wright represents the more conservative end of the spectrum. He defends the view that Jesus truly rose from the dead and claims this can be argued historically, but he still uses academic methods and emphasizes historical context. So even though scholars use the same tools, they often reach different conclusions, because history is not just about data, but about interpretation. That's why when evaluating a particular viewpoint, you should consider not just the conclusion, but how the scholar got there. In the end, these ancient texts are like layered narratives, shaped over time, carrying the memory of diverse early Christian communities. To truly understand them, we must ask not only what they say, but also why they say it that way. In this video, we've examined the texts of the New Testament one by one. We've asked, when were they written? By whom? For what purpose? And we followed these questions using the historical critical method. What we found is that the New Testament is not a unified narrative written by a single hand. It's a collection formed over decades, preserving the memories and voices of different communities. These writings are products of faith, but also documents of history. Not all of them are equally historical, equally original, or equally authentic, but each one carries the spirit of its time, and that makes them not only sacred, but also historically meaningful. Understanding why a text was written, for whom, and how it evolved over time does not have to undermine faith. On the contrary, this kind of reading can deepen one's connection to the text, moving beyond the surface into a more thoughtful engagement. Because meaning is often found not in the answers, but in the questions we've never thought to ask. In the end, every line holds both the voice of humanity and the longing for the divine. To understand the New Testament is not just to engage with a religion, it is to open a door into Western thought, art, law, and human history itself. These texts don't offer us one simple answer, but they teach us this. Faith is not only about what we believe, but how we come to believe it.